The crisp December morning air filled the grounds of Sandringham Estate as 10-year-old Prince George walked alongside his parents toward the traditional Christmas Day church service. What should have been a routine royal appearance quickly became the talk of photographers and onlookers alike. George had grown significantly over the past year, and his height was now unmistakably drawing attention. Catherine, the Princess of Wales, glanced down at her eldest son with a mixture of pride and surprise. She had noticed his growth spurts throughout the year, but seeing him walk confidently beside her in his navy coat and polished shoes made her realize just how much he had changed. His shoulders had broadened slightly, and his face was losing some of its childish roundness. Most striking of all was his height. He now reached just above her elbow, and his steady pace matched hers with ease. Prince William walked on George's other side, occasionally placing a protective hand on his son's shoulder. William remembered his own awkward growing years, the way his height had made him stand out in school photographs and family gatherings. But George seemed to carry himself with a natural confidence that William envied. The boy's posture was straight, his head held high, and he acknowledged the crowds with the same composed wave his parents had taught him. The media noticed immediately. Camera lenses focused intently on the young prince, capturing every angle of his transformed appearance. Royal correspondents whispered among themselves, making quick calculations about his current height compared to previous public appearances. Some estimated he had grown at least 4 inches since the summer, an impressive growth spurt that showed no signs of slowing down. Inside St. Mary Magdalene Church, the family took their traditional seats in the front pew. George sat between his parents, and even seated, his growth was evident. His legs, once dangling from church pews, now touched the floor comfortably. His prayer book looked smaller in his hands, and when he stood for hymns, he was noticeably closer to his mother's eye level than before. Catherine found herself stealing glances at her son throughout the service. She remembered the early days when George was small enough to curl up in her lap during long ceremonies. Now he sat independently, following the service with mature attention. His voice had begun to change subtly too. No longer the high, clear tone of a small child, but something deeper and more resonant. After the service, as the family mingled with well-wishers outside the church, the comments about George's height became impossible to ignore. Elderly parishioners remarked on how much he had grown, comparing him to his father at the same age. Children his own age seemed smaller beside him, and even some adults commented quietly about his impressive stature. "My goodness, George, I'm going to be taller than your father soon," laughed one longtime family friend, causing William to chuckle and ruffle his son's hair affectionately. But behind William's smile was a flicker of recognition. He could see the genetics at work. The same growth patterns that had made him tower over his classmates were now manifesting in his eldest son. The walk back to Sandringham House provided more opportunities for observation. George's stride had lengthened, and he no longer needed to hurry to keep up with his parents' pace. Instead, William and Catherine found themselves unconsciously matching their steps to his rhythm. Princess Charlotte, walking slightly behind with her grandparents, seemed tiny in comparison to her older brother, though she maintained her usual spirited chatter. Prince Louis, still small enough to require occasional carrying, looked up at his big brother with obvious admiration. The age gap between the siblings seemed more pronounced now, not just in years but in physical presence. George had begun to occupy space differently, moving with the cautious grace of someone still adjusting to their changing body. That evening, as the family gathered for their private Christmas dinner, the topic of George's growth became a gentle family discussion. The Queen, observing her great-grandson with her characteristic sharp eye, noted how he seemed more composed and thoughtful than in previous years. His table manners had improved, and he engaged in conversations with adults more readily. "He's developing quite nicely," she remarked to Catherine during a quiet moment. "Strong build, good posture. He'll cut quite a figure when he's older." The Queen had witnessed many royal children grow up, and She recognized the signs of someone who would command natural presence and authority. Catherine nodded, though she felt a familiar tug of maternal emotion. Part of her was proud of George's development, but another part mourned the gradual loss of her little boy. She remembered when he would climb into bed with them on lazy Sunday mornings, when his biggest concerns were toy trains and bedtime stories. Now he was developing interests in more sophisticated topics, asking questions about current events, and showing genuine curiosity about his future role. Social media buzzed with comments from people who had watched him grow up in the public eye. Many noted how much he resembled his father at the same age, while others pointed out features inherited from Catherine's side of the family. Fashion experts began speculating about how George's changing proportions might affect his public appearances. His clothes would need more frequent updates, and his presence at official events would need to be reconsidered as he became more prominent in photographs and public settings. The palace staff had already begun making subtle adjustments. George's security detail was briefed on his changing needs. He was now too big to be easily lifted or carried in emergency situations, and his increased visibility in crowds required different protective strategies. His personal staff started planning for the practical challenges of his continued growth, from adjusting his study spaces to considering his transportation needs. Back in their private quarters that night, William and Catherine tucked their children into bed with their usual routine, but even this familiar ritual highlighted the changes taking place. George's bed seemed smaller somehow, and his good-night embrace reached higher on Catherine's frame than it had just months before. As they prepared for bed themselves, William and Catherine found themselves discussing what George's continued growth might mean for the family dynamic. They had always known this day would come, but the reality of watching their eldest child physically mature brought new considerations and emotions they hadn't fully anticipated. The foundation had been set for a year of significant changes, not just for George, but for the entire family structure. His growth represented more than just physical development. It symbolized his gradual transformation from protected child to emerging young adult who would someday carry tremendous responsibility. The Christmas appearance at Sandringham had marked a turning point that everyone could see, and there was no going back to the little boy he had once been. Spring arrived early at Kensington Palace, and with it came another noticeable growth spurt for Prince George. By April, Catherine found herself standing eye to eye with her son during their morning conversations, a realization that hit her unexpectedly one Tuesday morning as they discussed his school schedule. She had been looking straight ahead while talking to him, not down as she had done for years. The moment caught her off guard, and she felt an unexpected wave of emotion wash over her. George seemed unaware of the milestone, focused instead on explaining his upcoming science project about renewable energy. His voice carried a new depth that still surprised Catherine at unexpected moments. When he laughed at something his father said during breakfast, the sound was richer, more resonant than the high giggles she remembered from just a year ago. William noticed the change too, particularly during their weekend football sessions in the palace gardens. George's kicks had gained power and accuracy, and his running stride covered more ground with each step. William found himself working harder to keep up during their casual games, genuinely challenged by his son's developing athletic abilities. The boy had inherited his height, but also his competitive spirit and natural coordination. "He's got real potential," William mentioned to Catherine after one particularly energetic afternoon match. George had demonstrated impressive ball control and strategic thinking that went beyond his years. The physical growth is just the beginning. His confidence is growing with it. The school had begun to take notice as well. George's teachers reported that his participation in class discussions had increased significantly. He was asking more complex questions and showing leadership qualities during group projects. His height naturally made him stand out among his peers, but his growing maturity made him someone other children looked up to in more ways than one. During a parent-teacher conference in late April, George's headmaster pulled William and Catherine aside for a private conversation. "We've noticed some remarkable development in George this term," he explained. "Not just physical, obviously, but in his academic engagement and social interactions. He's becoming quite the young leader." The headmaster went on to describe how George had naturally taken on mentoring roles with younger students, helping them with playground conflicts and including shy children in group activities. His height and presence made him approachable to younger kids while earning respect from his own age group. "There's something else we should discuss," the headmaster continued, his tone becoming more serious. "George's growth is quite exceptional. We may need to consider some adjustments to ensure he remains comfortable and confident in his environment." Catherine felt her protective instincts activate immediately. "What kind of adjustments?" she asked, trying to keep her voice steady. She had worried about George standing out too much, becoming self-conscious about his rapid development. "Nothing dramatic," the headmaster reassured them. "Perhaps modified seating arrangements, some wardrobe considerations for school events, and possibly some guidance on how to navigate the attention his height naturally draws. We want to ensure he feels supported rather than scrutinized." William appreciated the school's proactive approach, but the conversation reinforced his own growing concerns about public attention. Every royal appearance now generated comments about George's height, with media outlets tracking his growth like sports statistics. The attention was largely positive, but William remembered his own awkward teenage years and worried about the pressure building around his son. The Easter holidays provided some relief from public scrutiny, but even family gatherings highlighted George's transformation. During the traditional Easter egg hunt at Windsor Castle, George could reach hiding spots that had previously required adult help. His cousins looked up at him literally and figuratively, and he handled their admiration with characteristic grace. Catherine's mother, Carol Middleton, pulled her daughter aside during the Easter celebration. "He's really shot up, hasn't he?" she observed, watching George help organize younger children in hunting groups. "But he's handling it beautifully. You and William should be proud." "I am proud," Catherine replied, though her voice carried a note of wistfulness. "I just wasn't prepared for how quickly it would happen. One day he was my little boy, and suddenly he's becoming this confident young man." Carol understood her daughter's mixed emotions. She had experienced similar feelings watching Catherine and her siblings grow up, though without the added complexity of royal expectations and media attention. "He's still your little boy," she assured Catherine. "He's just getting bigger. The important parts haven't changed." The conversation proved prophetic during a quiet moment later that afternoon. George had found Catherine sitting alone in the palace gardens, taking a break from the family festivities. Without a word, he sat beside her on the bench and leaned against her shoulder, just as he had done when he was small. His head now reached above her shoulder, but the gesture carried the same comfort and affection it always had. "Are you okay, Mama?" he asked, using the childhood name that he still reserved for private moments. His concern was genuine, and Catherine realized that despite his physical changes, his emotional connection to her remained unchanged. "Just thinking about how much you've grown," she admitted, wrapping her arm around him. "Sometimes it happens so fast it takes me by surprise." George considered this seriously, displaying the thoughtfulness that had developed alongside his physical growth. "I'm still me," he said simply, "just taller." His matter-of-fact response made Catherine smile. George had always possessed wisdom beyond his years, but his growing confidence allowed him to express it more clearly. She realized that while his body was changing rapidly, his essential character remained the same: kind, thoughtful, and surprisingly wise. The spring months also brought new challenges as George's wardrobe required constant updating. His formal suits needed alterations every few weeks, and casual clothes that fit in March were too small by May. Catherine found herself in regular consultation with the palace's wardrobe staff, trying to balance George's need for properly fitting clothes with budget considerations and the environmental impact of constant replacements. "Perhaps we should consider a slightly looser fit," suggested the head of wardrobe, during one particularly frustrating fitting session. George had grown out of a suit that had been tailored just 6 weeks earlier, something that allows for continued growth without looking oversized. George stood patiently during these fittings, having learned to accept them as part of his life. He showed remarkable maturity about the inconvenience, understanding that his public appearances required careful attention to his appearance. Sometimes he would make jokes to lighten the mood, displaying a sense of humor that helped everyone cope with the constant adjustments. The media attention reached a new level in May when George attended a charity football match with his father. Photographs clearly showed him standing nearly as tall as some of the adult players' wives, and significantly taller than other children his age. The images sparked renewed speculation about his ultimate height and comparisons to his father's teenage years. "Future King towers over peers," read one headline, accompanied by side-by-side photos showing George's growth over the past year. While the coverage was generally positive, William and Catherine worried about the pressure such attention might place on their son. They decided to address the topic directly with George, sitting him down for an honest conversation about the media interest in his height. They wanted to ensure he understood the attention without feeling burdened by it. "People are interested in our family," William explained carefully. "Sometimes that means they pay attention to things like how much you've grown. How do you feel about that?" George thought for a moment before responding. "It's a bit odd," he admitted, "but I suppose it's better than them saying something mean." His pragmatic response impressed both parents and demonstrated his developing understanding of his unique position. "The important thing," Catherine added, "is that you never feel like you have to hide who you are or how you look. You're perfect exactly as you are, and we're proud of you." George nodded seriously, then grinned. "Besides, being tall might help me be a better king someday. I'll be able to see over the crowds." His humor and perspective delighted his parents and reinforced their confidence in his ability to handle whatever challenges his growth might bring. As spring turned toward summer, George's height stabilized somewhat, giving everyone a chance to adjust to his new proportions. But the underlying changes continued: his confidence, his voice, his presence in any room. He was becoming someone new while remaining fundamentally himself, and his family was learning to navigate this transformation together. The spring growth spurt had tested everyone's adaptability, but it had also revealed George's remarkable resilience and maturity. He was growing into his role as future king in every sense, physically and emotionally, and those around him were beginning to see glimpses of the leader he might one day become. The summer holidays brought unexpected revelations about how George's growth was reshaping family relationships in ways no one had anticipated. During their annual retreat to Balmoral Castle in Scotland, Catherine made a startling discovery while organizing a family hiking expedition. As she stood next to George to check his backpack straps, she realized with a jolt that she was now looking up slightly to meet his eyes. The moment hit her like a physical blow. Her 10-year-old son had not only reached her height, but had quietly surpassed it. Catherine stood 5 feet 9 inches tall, a height that had always made her one of the taller women in any room. Now her eldest child towered over her by at least an inch, possibly more. "When did this happen?" she whispered to herself, staring at George in amazement. He was adjusting his hiking boots, completely unaware of the milestone he had crossed. His movements had gained a fluid grace that reminded her of William at the same age, but seeing it in her own child felt surreal. George looked up from his boots and caught his mother's expression. "What's wrong, Mama?" he asked, concern evident in his deeper voice. The caring tone was purely George, unchanged despite his physical transformation. "Nothing's wrong," Catherine managed, reaching up to smooth his hair in a gesture that felt strange and wonderful at the same time. "I just realized how tall you've gotten." William emerged from the castle at that moment, ready for their hike, and immediately noticed the scene. His wife stood slightly below their son's eye level, creating a visual he had been unconsciously expecting, but still found shocking to witness. George had crossed a threshold that made his impending teenage years feel suddenly imminent. "Well," William said with a mixture of pride and amazement. "I suppose we should start taking bets on when you'll pass me too." George grinned at his father's comment, but the interaction revealed something deeper. He was beginning to occupy physical space in a way that changed family dynamics. During their hike through the Highland Trails, George naturally took the lead in many situations, his longer stride and increased endurance making him a natural pace setter for the group. Princess Charlotte, walking alongside her grandmother, kept looking up at her big brother with a mixture of admiration and bewilderment. "George is like a giant now," she announced matter-of-factly to anyone within hearing range. Her innocent observation made the adults laugh, but it also highlighted how dramatic the change appeared to younger family members. Prince Louis, still small enough to ride on his father's shoulders occasionally, seemed fascinated by his brother's height. During rest stops, he would stand next to George and stretch his arms up as high as possible, try to reach his brother's head. The gesture was endearing, but also emphasized the growing gap between the siblings. The hiking expedition revealed other aspects of George's development that went beyond mere height. His stamina had increased dramatically, and he showed natural leadership skills when the family encountered challenging terrain. He instinctively helped his younger siblings navigate difficult paths and showed genuine concern for everyone's comfort and safety. "He's developing real character," observed his grandfather, watching George patiently help Charlotte across a particularly tricky stream crossing. "The height is obvious, but the way he's carrying himself, the responsibility he's taking, that's what matters most." Catherine noticed it too. George had begun unconsciously adopting protective behaviors toward his siblings and even toward her in certain situations. During a sudden summer rainstorm, he positioned himself to shield Charlotte from the worst of the wind and rain, his broader frame providing effective protection. That evening, as the family gathered for dinner in Balmoral's more informal dining room, George's new proportions became even more apparent. The chairs that had accommodated him comfortably just months earlier now looked too small. His knees bumped against the table edge, and he had to adjust his posture constantly to remain comfortable. "We might need to think about some furniture adjustments," William mentioned quietly to Catherine during dinner. It was a small thing, but it represented a larger reality. George's growth was requiring practical changes to accommodate his new size and spaces designed for his previous proportions. The Queen, observing the situation with her characteristic attention to detail, made her own quiet adjustments. She ensured George was seated at the head of one section of the table, giving him more room to maneuver comfortably. Her subtle consideration demonstrated her understanding that George needed support during this transitional period. After dinner, during their traditional game time, George's physical changes created new dynamics in family activities. Board games that had previously been played at coffee table height were now more comfortable at the dining table, where George could sit properly without hunching over. His longer arms gave him advantages in some activities while creating awkward moments in others. The most poignant moment came during their traditional bedtime routine. For years, William or Catherine would sit on the edge of George's bed to read stories or chat about the day. Now, when Catherine perched on his bed, George's height made the positioning feel different. He seemed to take up more space, and their eye contact happened at a more equal level. "You know what's funny?" George said during one of these bedtime conversations. "Everything feels smaller now. My room, my desk at school, even my bicycle." His observation was delivered without complaint, simply as an interesting fact about his changing perspective on the world. Catherine realized that George was experiencing a fundamental shift in how he related to his physical environment. Objects and spaces that had once seemed large and adult-sized were becoming proportionally smaller as he grew. This change went beyond simple height. It represented a gradual transition from a child's view of the world to something approaching an adult perspective. The summer also brought new challenges in managing George's public appearances. During a charity garden party at Kensington Palace, his height drew constant attention from guests who hadn't seen him in months. The comments were universally positive, but The sheer volume of remarks about his growth seemed to make George slightly self-conscious for the first time. "My goodness, George, you must be 6 feet tall by now," exclaimed one well-meaning guest, causing George to shift uncomfortably and glance toward his parent for support. While he was nowhere near 6 feet, closer to 5 feet 6 inches, the exaggeration highlighted how his height had become a primary topic of conversation. William and Catherine developed strategies to help George navigate these interactions gracefully. They taught him polite responses to height-related comments and encouraged him to redirect conversations toward his interests and activities rather than his physical appearance. "Thank you, I have grown quite a bit this year," became George's standard response, followed by questions about the other person or comments about the event they were attending. His natural politeness and growing social skills helped him handle the attention maturely, though his parents could see that the constant focus on his height sometimes made him uncomfortable. The summer months also revealed how George's growth was affecting his relationships with friends. When school friends visited Kensington Palace for play dates, the height difference was striking. Some children seemed intimidated initially, while others were fascinated. George showed remarkable sensitivity in navigating these dynamics, often sitting down during conversations to reduce the height disparity or choosing activities that minimized the physical differences. His best friend, Marcus, seemed particularly affected by George's growth. During one visit, Marcus's mother quietly mentioned to Catherine that her son had expressed feeling small around George lately. This feedback prompted a family discussion about how George could maintain his friendships while managing his changing physical presence. "It's not about hiding who you are," William explained to George during one of their father-son conversations. "It's about being aware that your size can affect how others feel and making sure everyone feels comfortable around you." George took this advice seriously, demonstrating emotional intelligence that impressed his parents. He began consciously modulating his physical presence in social situations, sitting when others stood, choosing his position in group photos carefully, and showing extra consideration for smaller children or peers who seemed overwhelmed by his height. The summer at Balmoral culminated in a family photograph session that would later become significant in royal history. The images captured George at a pivotal moment, clearly taller than his mother, approaching his father's shoulder height, and carrying himself with a confidence that seemed to preview the man he would become. But, perhaps more importantly, the photographs showed a family adapting to change together. William had one hand on George's shoulder in a gesture that seemed both proud and protective. Catherine stood close to her eldest son with obvious affection, her face showing no sign of the emotional adjustment she had been navigating privately. Charlotte and Louis flanked their big brother naturally, still clearly viewing him as their playmate despite his imposing height. As summer drew to a close, the family had found new rhythms that accommodated George's growth. Furniture had been adjusted, routines had been modified, and expectations had been recalibrated. Most importantly, they had maintained the emotional connections that made them a strong family unit, even as the physical dynamics continued to evolve. The summer had tested everyone's adaptability and revealed strengths they didn't know they possessed. George had shown remarkable maturity in handling his changing body and the attention it drew. His parents had demonstrated flexibility and wisdom in supporting him through the transition. And the entire family had proven that love and connection could adapt to any physical changes, no matter how dramatic or unexpected. As autumn arrived and George prepared to begin a new school year, the family had reached a turning point in their relationship with his remarkable growth. The initial surprise and adjustment period had evolved into acceptance and even celebration of the young man he was becoming. The changes were no longer shocking developments to navigate, but simply part of George's continuing evolution. The first day of the new school term provided a powerful visual reminder of how much had changed. As George walked through the school gates alongside his classmates, he stood out like a young oak among saplings. His school uniform had been specially tailored to accommodate his height, but Even perfectly fitted clothes couldn't disguise the fact that he was experiencing exceptional growth for his age. His new teacher, Ms. Richardson, had been briefed about George's rapid development and made immediate accommodations. His desk was positioned to allow for his longer legs, and she was careful to rotate seating arrangements so he didn't always tower over his classmates during group activities. Her thoughtful approach helped George settle into the new academic year with confidence rather than self-consciousness. During the first parent-teacher conference of the year, Ms. Richardson shared observations that delighted William and Catherine. "George has shown remarkable leadership qualities this term," she reported. "His height naturally draws attention, but he's learned to use that presence positively. Other children look up to him literally and figuratively, and he handles that responsibility beautifully." She described how George had become a natural mediator during playground disputes, using his imposing presence to command attention while resolving conflicts with fairness and wisdom beyond his years. His growth had given him a platform for leadership that he was learning to use effectively. "There's something else worth noting," Ms. Richardson continued. "George shows exceptional emotional intelligence for someone his age. He's very aware of how his size affects others and makes conscious efforts to put everyone at ease. That level of self-awareness is quite remarkable in a child." Catherine felt a surge of maternal pride hearing these observations. The qualities Ms. Richardson described were exactly the character traits she and William had hoped to instill in their children. George's physical growth seemed to be accompanied by parallel emotional and social development. The autumn months brought new opportunities for George to demonstrate his maturing capabilities. During a family visit to a children's hospital, his height allowed him to connect with older patients who might have found a smaller child less relatable. Teenage patients, in particular, responded positively to George's presence, seeing him as closer to a peer than a typical 10-year-old visitor. One interaction particularly moved Catherine. A 14-year-old patient confined to a wheelchair for several months had been withdrawn and unresponsive to most visitors. When George approached and knelt down to bring himself to eye level with the boy, something shifted. The patient began talking, sharing his frustrations about feeling different and isolated due to his condition. George listened with genuine attention and then shared his own experiences of rapid growth, making him feel different from his peers. "Sometimes I feel like I don't fit anywhere," he admitted quietly. "Too big for some things, not big enough for others. But my mom says being different just means you have different gifts to share." The conversation continued for nearly an hour, with George's natural empathy and unique perspective providing comfort the medical staff hadn't been able to achieve. Watching from nearby, Catherine realized that George's growth wasn't just physical. He was developing the emotional capacity to use his experiences to help others. William had his own revelations during their autumn rugby matches in the Palace Gardens. George's increased size and strength had made their games genuinely competitive. William found himself strategizing and exerting real effort to maintain his advantage, knowing that within a year or two, their matches would require his full athletic ability. "He's got natural talent," William confided to Catherine after one particularly intense game. "But more than that, he's developing the mental aspects of sport, strategy, teamwork, perseverance. The physical gifts are obvious, but the character development is what excites me most." George's relationship with his siblings had also evolved in beautiful ways. Rather than creating distance, his height had enhanced his role as protective older brother. Charlotte had begun confiding in him about school problems, seeking his advice with the assumption that his size somehow correlated with wisdom. George handled these conversations with surprising maturity, offering thoughtful guidance while remaining appropriately childlike in their playtime together. Prince Louis had developed a charming habit of using George as a human jungle gym, climbing on him during family movie nights and requesting piggyback rides around the palace gardens. George accommodated these requests with patience and obvious affection, understanding instinctively that his little brother needed physical connection to maintain their bond despite the growing size difference. The late autumn brought an unexpected opportunity that would become a defining moment in George's development. The family attended a state dinner where George, for the first time, was included in the formal receiving line alongside his parents. His height made him appear older than his years, and visiting dignitaries addressed him with the respect typically reserved for teenage royals. One particular interaction stood out. The president of a small European nation approached George during the reception and engaged him in a substantial conversation about environmental conservation, apparently unaware of George's actual age. George responded thoughtfully, drawing on knowledge from his school studies and demonstrating poise that impressed everyone present. "Your son handled himself remarkably well tonight," the foreign secretary mentioned to William later in the evening. "His presence and composure were quite impressive for someone so young. He has a natural authority that will serve him well in his future role." William felt a complex mix of pride and poignancy hearing these words. George was clearly developing the qualities necessary for his eventual role as king, but William also felt the weight of time accelerating. His son's rapid physical and emotional growth seemed to be compressing the timeline of childhood, bringing adult responsibilities closer than William had expected. The family's Christmas card photo session in November became an exercise in accepting new realities. The photographer struggled initially with the composition, as traditional arrangements looked awkward with George's height. Eventually, they settled on more casual, natural poses that accommodated everyone's proportions while maintaining the warm, approachable image the family preferred. When the official photos were released, media reaction was immediate and overwhelmingly positive. Royal correspondents noted George's confident posture and mature bearing while praising the family's natural chemistry. Comments focused less on his height as an oddity and more on his emergence as a genuine young royal with obvious leadership potential. One particularly insightful article noted, "Prince George's remarkable growth seems to mirror his developing presence within the royal family. He carries himself with quiet confidence that suggests natural leadership abilities, while maintaining the warmth and approachability that have made him a public favorite. His height has become less a curiosity and more a symbol of his readiness to embrace his future responsibilities." Catherine found herself surprisingly moved by this coverage. The initial concern about George becoming self-conscious had evolved into appreciation for how gracefully he was handling his unique situation. Rather than hiding from attention, he was learning to use his presence positively. As winter settled over London, the family established new traditions that accommodated George's continued growth. Family game nights moved permanently to the dining table, where everyone could sit comfortably. Movie nights included a collection of cushions and blankets arranged to ensure George could stretch out without overwhelming the seating area. Most significantly, family conversations had evolved to include George's perspective on more sophisticated topics. His height seemed to have unlocked access to more adult discussions, and his contributions showed genuine insight and wisdom. He asked thoughtful questions about current events, royal duties, and social issues that revealed his growing understanding of the world beyond his immediate experience. During one memorable evening conversation about charitable work, George suggested organizing a youth leadership workshop where older children could mentor younger ones in various activities. His idea demonstrated understanding of how his own experience of rapid growth could be channeled into helping others navigate their own challenges. "We could have different activities for different interests," he explained enthusiastically. "Sports for athletic kids, art projects for creative ones, science experiments for kids who love learning. The idea is that everyone has something to teach and something to learn, no matter how old they are." William and Catherine exchanged glances of amazement. George's proposal showed sophisticated thinking about leadership, inclusion, and service, concepts that would be central to his future role as king. His growth had not only changed his physical presence, but had somehow accelerated his emotional and intellectual development. As the year drew to a close, the family reflected on the transformative journey they had shared. George's growth had initially felt like something happening to them, requiring constant adjustment and accommodation. Now it felt like something they were experiencing together, with each family member contributing to George's development while growing themselves. Catherine had learned to embrace her son's transition from child to young man, finding joy in his emerging capabilities rather than mourning his lost childhood. William had discovered unexpected satisfaction in watching George develop qualities that would serve him well as a future leader. Charlotte and Louis had adapted naturally to their brother's changing presence, while maintaining the sibling bonds that anchored their family relationships. Most importantly, George himself had grown into his changing body and circumstances with remarkable grace. He had learned to use his height and presence thoughtfully, understanding both the opportunities and responsibilities that came with standing out from his peers. His character had proven equal to the physical changes he was experiencing. As they prepared for another Christmas season, the family faced the future with confidence and excitement. George's growth continued, but it no longer felt like an upheaval to manage. Instead, it represented the natural evolution of a remarkable young person who was becoming exactly who he was meant to be, a future king with a physical presence, emotional intelligence, and strength of character to serve his people effectively. The journey that had begun with surprised observations about a growing boy had evolved into a family's successful navigation of change, growth, and the emergence of true leadership potential. George's height had been the catalyst, but the real story was about a family's love, adaptability, and shared commitment to supporting each other through life's most significant transitions.